Hello and welcome to One on One. I'm Vernon Ramazan. I'm very pleased to say my guest today is Carl Obst, who's a consultant in natural capital accounting and former editor at the UN System of Environmental Economic Accounting. Welcome to the program and to your first time on TV.
Indeed.
So let's see how you do.
Thank you.
Well, first of all, I have to ask you why you're here, but before we even do that, a lot of people will look at your title on the screen and be enormously puzzled at the idea of natural capital accounting. What is it?
Yeah, that's a great first question. And in some ways it does seem a bit incongruous to think that there could be accounting for something natural. But the effort is to try and see whether or not we can link together and put into place measures that link the economy and the environment. So natural capital is a term which is used to try and describe what exists in the environment. So it could be mineral and energy resources, but also our water resources, soil resources, forests, animals, and the whole range of benefits that we get from all of those assets working together. The accounting side of it is coming to the notion that we might be useful to measure those on a regular basis and an ongoing basis, which traditionally hasn't been the type of thing that we do. And particularly we don't tend to focus on measuring the way in which we use the natural capital in the way in which we generate our economic activity. So the idea, there is a process by which we go about measuring the economy. It's commonly seen in the measures of gross domestic product, or GDP. And there's a whole accounting system that underpins GDP, and it's called the national accounts. It's been around for probably 60 or 70 years. But most of the time it doesn't take into direct consideration all of these benefits that we get from the environment. And so the attempt of natural capital accounting is to try and integrate all of that information on the environment and natural capital with the economic activity around GDP. So getting a broader understanding of economic activity and the wealth of a country.
It obviously presents challenges in quantifying certain things, I imagine, which from an accounting perspective is never a good thing when you don't have accurate figures.
Yep.
How does one deal with that in your field?
Partly it's just taking one step at a time. A lot of the challenges in part you can certainly come across many measurement challenges. And sometimes the environment just seems impossibly complex, and how can you pick up all of those things? So the attempt that we take is to try and break things down a little bit. And so we have a definition of natural capital. We actually use the term environmental assets. And in the first instance, we break that down into the different parts. So it might be water, soil, timber, fish, mineral resources. And then for each one, we have a look and say, okay, can we work out how many mineral and energy resources there are? And it turns out there's geologists and geoscientists, right, and there's large companies who work on the basis of understanding how many mineral and energy resources there are in a country. And the same, you can do the same for water resources and timber, and understanding the area of forests and working out how much timber there is. So taking that one step at a time, and then using the accounting logic, which the accounting logic is essentially around assets, is to say we had this much at the beginning, we've got this much at the end. How did they change? What went up? What went down? Did we just take it out of the ground? Did we find some discoveries? And you try and make sure you're reconciling everything so that it matches together. So each one has a sort of a different measurement technique and a different measurement challenge, but nonetheless it's sort of taking one step at a time.
Yes, I suppose to some extent, most countries, certainly if we look at Trinidad and Tobago, we have a sort of a natural capital value of our oil reserves and gas reserves. So
yep,
that's something that a lot of countries have been dealing with for a long time.
Yep.
But there are other things that are a bit more ethereal, aren't there? You mentioned sort of animal diversity, for example.
Yep.
How do you measure the economic cash value of that?
Yeah. And, well, indeed, that's probably...
Or a healthy environment, for example,
or a healthy
which has a value in itself.
Yeah. So one of the things we try and do is distinguish between sort of the physical measurement of it, of how many animals there are or how many hectares of forest, and the valuation side of things. So that's that separation of the physical from the monetary, as it were, is a key thing that we try and do. And we try and say that you can account for both. You can account for the physical changes, and you can also account for the things in a monetary sense. So in the first challenge is largely because most of these environmental assets and natural capital are not sold on markets, and those ethereal elements are not done that way, we try and make sure that we focus on getting that physical idea of things first. So if it comes to something like biodiversity and the whole quality of the environment, the approach that we tend to take is one where we break a country into different areas. So it might be breaking it into forests, wetlands, agricultural areas, and then for each different type we try and think of a set of characteristics that might be common in those areas, and then try and blend those indicators together to give you some sense of change over time. So and admittedly, this area is one where we're still working on. There's a lot of work going on at the moment around the world to try and get to those types of questions. And then we start thinking about, well, what are all the benefits that we get from these areas? So, for example, the Northern Ranges here in Trinidad, there's a lot of water that's generated in those ranges. So we start thinking, well, there's some what we call ecosystem services or environmental services. And we can say, and one of those is water that we get from the Northern Ranges. So we can say, well, from that area, we get this amount of water services. Can we put a price on the value of those water services? And then if you added up the value of each of the different services, you get sort of an estimate of the value of the ecosystem. That's the logic.
And how does that benefit countries then, in terms of if at some point we're able to quantify the value of all these various things in an individual country, I guess at some point we'll move from GDP to some other term that we'll use for the actual value of what's in that country produced. How does that benefit a country in terms of its overall health, economic health?
Yeah, I think the main point would probably, you're right in saying that sort of somewhat ultimately you could get to that point of having alternative measures of GDP, but that's somewhere down the track. And I think it's certainly many of the benefits you can get from this approach can be gained before that point. Largely, it's really trying to take a different attitude to the way in which you look at the way in which you might be looking at the country. So traditionally, development has been very much focused on GDP per capita, and as a symbol, a signal of success and moving forward. The attempt here in natural capital accounting is to really say, well, is that a broad enough perspective? Can we really look at some additional factors which we might want to take into consideration? Are there in fact environmental costs? Are there additional benefits that we get from the environment that we're not capturing in that standard approach? So the benefit then for the users is to say, well, can we have a broader discussion? Can we broaden the information set so that discussion is more informed? We have a sense of not just the economic history of a country, but the environmental history of a country. That's commonly agreed, and we can then start forward from that point. So it's a broadening of the discussion, which is...
So it's another indicator that we can use in terms of determining trends and how countries are going.
And assessing trade-offs between alternatives. I think that's probably one of the key things that comes out, and the more you work on this sort of area, is that there are a lot of choices that you can take in terms of how you might use the environment and the land that you have within a country, and the marine environment for that matter. So it's looking at, can we sort of assess those trade-offs in a way which allows you to have data which is comparable. And one of the challenges often in an environmental space is that the information can be very site-specific. So you can end up with information that's very sort of focused on a particular area, which is very relevant. Every environmental area is somewhat different. But it then makes it difficult to integrate that information with a macroeconomic picture of GDP and different industries. So part of the aim here is to try and scale things up, scale the discussion on the environment up to a national level, and then have that in parallel and in concert with a discussion on economic activity.
I guess if Bhutan can have the gross national happiness, I mean, this is certainly not something to sniff at either.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, in any sort of economic discussion, you're going to have assets and liabilities and as discussions.
Yeah.
Would you be looking at sort of negative economic indicators, for example, when you're looking at, for example, let's say smog in Beijing? Yeah. Would that be a negative indicator that you'd have to factor in and subtract from the overall?
Yeah, this is really quite where the accounting sometimes gets difficult to explain. So one of the things that we try and do is make a distinction between our environmental assets on the one hand and the services that we get from the environment on the other hand. And in the case of something like air pollution in Beijing, what we'd be looking at is saying, well, if we're looking at the area of Beijing, could we have some indicators of how it's changing in quality as an area? And obviously higher air pollution would say that your indicator was going down. What that would give you an indicator of, or part of an indicator of, is a measure of degradation of that area. And you might want to then say, well, we could say that degradation is a cost that should be attributed to activity in some way, shape or form. Whether that then ends up as a negative by the time you've added on the benefits you get from certain activities and then subtract the costs. But it's certainly, I mean, potentially you could get at some sort of negative amount, but it's more a matter of trying to take it into account at all. A common phrase that comes up in this field is, at the moment, if you don't measure anything at all, you're assuming that the value of the environment is zero. and we're just trying to say, well, what is it? Is it actually, it's not zero, that's the wrong answer. So you're better off, even if you can't get a perfect number, to be at least heading in that direction of integration.
So basically you're looking at a broader way of looking at nations and economies, which for many, many years people thought, well, it's nice to have a good environment, for example, or nice to have the natural world in our nation looking all spiffy.
Yeah.
But you're saying, no, if we actually place a value on it, then we sort of tend to not take it for granted afterwards. If there is a value in having a good environment and a diverse ecosystem, for example.
Yeah. And at the heart of it, I think, is, at least the perspective I come at it from, is at least we should be making eyes open decisions about the choices we take, about how a society grows, how an economy functions, to recognise that the environment, we depend on it for many things, not just air quality, for the water we use, but if you're a farmer, you're using the soil and the pollination that comes from the surrounding areas. So you've got all of these dependencies which we just take for granted simply because we don't usually have to pay Mother Earth for the services. And so that potential to just integrate that type of information to our thinking means that if we're making choices, we still may decide to build a road in a particular space or expand agriculture because of food security issues or those types of things. But at least you're doing it in an eyes open way.
There's sort of a cost-benefit sort of look at everything.
You could see it as a standard risk analysis in a sense, that we should be having that forward look at what all of the risks are.
No, I know accountants tend to like to keep things simple. You're adding layers of complexity to this whole thing that I'm sure would give people headaches.
Yeah.
So how do you convince people that it's worth the effort?
I still work on that one.
Convincing yourself.
Yeah, well, not convincing myself so much, but trying to work out the best way to present it. It is certainly, part of it for me is to, one of the recognitions I've come at it from being an economist background and an accountant, is that we've got a very particular way of viewing the world, and this notion of stocks and flows and things is a very refined, and you can get into, well, accountants can talk forever on what the boundaries are.
Put everybody to sleep doing it.
Yeah, indeed, except each other.
Yeah, well, of course.
But when you're interacting with the environmental type of information, you're in a much biophysical space. They're real trees and they're real bees and those types of things. So the challenge I see is to try and see that there is a potential to be able to think about these biophysical things within this same accounting framework. And to probably not focus so much on the accounting framework, to focus a bit more on the type of information that you can get out, the type of indicators that you might generate in terms of starting to look at not just relationships to GDP, but for example, well, in say an agricultural setting, you might want to look at indicators of water use per tonne of papayas produced. I'm trying to think of
a random thing you pulled out.
Yeah, that's right. Well, I saw some the other day when I was up in the Carra Valley. So it's trying to think about what are those biophysical relationships that will be helpful for understanding. So breaking it down into the indicators that are of interest is probably one way into it.
I imagine one difficulty you would face in this new approach would be that there would be sort of relative values based on countries sometimes, because one country will place more value in something than another would. How would you deal with it? It leads to a level of inexactitude, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think in that situation, this whole question of value does become, it's a very relative type of thing. I think the essence of the whole approach is, in a sense, you're trying to deal with a level of decisions which is affecting a society, a particular society, and it's really up to that society to decide what it values more than one thing or another. It can't be a sort of a universally imposed price, as it were, or so you should value this more than another. So it's really, and that's part of the reason for focusing on the physical relationships in the first instance. Without an understanding of what all of the possible connections are, you're not going to be then assessing your relative values across a broad enough range of things.
Well, that makes it rather different to GDP, doesn't it? Which is, of course, I mean, you can apply and compare countries based on their GDP.
Except for the fact that what you do implicitly do, terrible English.
It's okay, you're Australian.
When you're compiling GDP, you're essentially looking at the different value of different industries in the same way, but your scope is narrower. But you're using prices for a particular industry, and it just turns out because there are markets, the prices for oil and gas, or for cars, for water, are defined in a marketplace. So those prices come out, those relative values come out in a marketplace. The challenge in this, so essentially the process is exactly the same. It's just that trying to find those relative values is not as obvious. And so it may mean that you need to have the sort of broader discussion about how to value your biodiversity resources as opposed to your oil and gas resources, because the prices aren't as obvious.
And it's also situational as well. I mean, for example, if you're in, let's say, Canada, and you've got more fresh water than you know what to do with, you would value that water, intrinsically you would as an individual value that water less because there's so much of it compared to, let's say, an Israeli or somebody in another dry part of the world.
Indeed. And that should be something that you take into account. I mean, from an economics point of view, that issue of scarcity is really one that does drive value. But at the same time, there are other things that we value that I think, other ways of looking at it just from the actual price that's on the market that we need to think about. They're obviously harder to bring into some sort of discussion, and it also means that the actual step of moving from biophysical to monetary in a complete sense is very difficult, because there's these sort of some intrinsic values that we'd like to think that you might want to think about, which probably can only be decided by just a public discourse on whether we do really think that maintaining a certain number of species in the Northern Ranges is a sensible idea. So trading off those values is really a public discussion on value as opposed to a market-driven focus on value.
I guess it makes sense, and you're sort of combining economics, which at best is an inexact science, quite frankly, and accounting, which is a very exact science, and you're sort of trying to marry the two, and there will naturally be some blurring in between, or some inexactitude is to be expected.
Well, I think it's also the fact that any measurement that you do, there will be some inexactness, but I think it's important to see the measurement as a means to an end. It's not the end. I mean, accountants can get carried away that they've got a beautiful set of numbers, and that can be a wonderful thing, but at the end of the day, it's only a piece of information towards someone making a decision or a choice. So the natural capital accounting is in economic terms necessary, but it's certainly not sufficient in terms of taking the whole debate forward.
And would probably be the world's largest spreadsheet in any case.
Didn't get quite messy.
No, we mentioned at the beginning that you are obviously here in my studio, so therefore you are in Trinidad and Tobago.
Indeed.
Let me ask you what brings you here.
I've been working in this area of natural capital accounting for the last 4 years or so, and my background is in statistics, so working for the Australian Bureau of Statistics. And so the statistical world has sort of come up with a whole process about developing some standards in this area of extending the national accounts, essentially. And through that, more recently, we've got it linked into a range of other projects which seem to be going on around the world, and one of those is a Pro-Eco-Serve, the Project for Ecosystem Services, which is operating within Trinidad and started up a couple of years ago. And they had 3 angles to the project, and one of those was looking at this idea of natural capital accounting, or extending the current national accounts within Trinidad and Tobago to see what was possible. So I've come here as a technical consultant and doing some work with people at UWI over the next through the course of the next few months to try and get some ideas about what it might look like. Obviously the environment's quite big, so the bits that you want to focus on, you can't do it all at once. So trying to make some decisions about where we might focus some initial energies, perhaps look at some pilot accounts, but then look at some scoping paper about what the possibilities are given the data that's currently available in Trinidad and Tobago, and the type of questions that might want to be solved, and see what can be done and get some proposals and ideas for next steps.
Could this possibly guide government policy?
I'd like to think so. Yeah, I mean, in a sense, if we were doing it as a purely academic exercise, I don't think it would be of as much interest to me. I mean, I do find it interesting academically, but at the same time, there should be a real need and a purpose for this. And at the same time, I don't think it necessarily depends on what environmental policy or economic policy you want to pursue. It's really the notion that a broader information set should give a better basis for considering all of the different risks.
Because I mean, we see it certainly in Trinidad and Tobago, the cost benefit. For example, there's a highway construction project. There was some objection to that by a group. I know you're not in any way involved or probably have no views in the matter. But then you had environmentalists saying, but no, there are other considerations that should be taken into account. Yep. There's a value to this natural. That's really what it's all about, isn't it?
It is.
To some extent.
To some extent. And I think one of the aspects that we try and get across in the natural capital accounting is it's not the idea of you could certainly apply the approach in individual cases. It certainly would apply, and you could do a cost-benefit type of analysis in a particular case. What we're trying to go for, though, is the notion that you might be able to do an ongoing monitoring situation, so that you'd have a broad sweep across the country on an ongoing basis, in the same way as economic activity is measured on an ongoing basis. We don't just decide to measure GDP when we're thinking of developing a new industrial plant.
Right.
You know, so GDP is there, it's measured continuously. Some parts are more important at some times than others, depending on the economic activity. And it would be the same in this environmental sort of situation, that you'd want to measure all of the aspects of the environment on an ongoing basis. And then if there were a particular situation that emerged in terms of a competing use of land, effectively, you'd have a structure and a mindset that said, right, what we need is we need to do that. So you're essentially training people up to use additional information to look at these types of issues, rather than making it sort of one-off ad hoc. Perhaps also getting a stronger sense of that, that history and using that to sort of understand where things have happened in the past.
Now, I guess to make the approach more effective, it would be useful, I would imagine, to have a school of thought that worked on the subject and sort of did further studies and analysis. How many of you are there?
It's a good question.
I mean, given that you came halfway across the world to be a consultant here, I presume there aren't that many people working in your field, or am I wrong?
There's, what I find most interesting is that I'm finding an increasing number of people who are attracted to the subject. If I come from the background that I've come from a statistical background, and in actual fact, my previous life I was looking after the measurement of GDP in Australia. So if you come from that background, there's probably a growing community of 100 to 200 statisticians around the world and other experts who have come at it from that perspective. What I'm coming across now, though, is an increasing number of academics, such as Professor John Agard at UWI, who have had an interest in this from perhaps an academic perspective in sustainable development, notions of environmental sustainability for a long time as well. And I won't hazard a guess at how many of those there are, certainly in the hundreds. An increasing number that I'm also running into now are people from a corporate perspective. So there are efforts, many of which have sort of fallen out of the Rio process from '92 and then Rio Plus 10, Rio Plus 20, about how can corporations start to think about reporting and accounting on their environmental links. And so there's a growing number of people who are both sort of working within, say, some of the larger accounting firms like Ernst & Young and PwC, Deloitte, those type of companies, who have sustainability areas, and they're essentially working on a very similar type of thing, just at a corporate level. So what we're starting to see is a little bit of a linking together of these different academic, corporate, and perhaps more a government official statistical measurement side of things. Because in actual fact, what we're doing is not all that different.
It's basically a hybridized sort of field of study, isn't it?
Very much. It actually falls...
Well, you're hybridized in that you've crossed economics, accounting, and stats.
Yeah, and trying to learn something about biophysical things, which is a challenge from my point of view. But there's a whole field as well of what they call ecological economics, which has sort of emerged over the last 10 years or so, which is trying to take ecology, ecologists, who are looking at things from a very systematic perspective and how things link together, and how they can link that with economics and sort of bring that together. And that's really only quite a recent field.
Do you think it was led to by the fact that human populations are putting increasing pressure on the natural world, and therefore we need to sort of recognize the impact of that pressure and the value of the natural world to us?
Absolutely, no doubt. Absolutely, no doubt that's the driver. I mean, in reality, a lot of the thinking for this has been around for 40 or 50 years. It's not new that there's an environmental impact. And the initial work, from a statistical point of view, there was a handbook released in 1993 in the wake of Rio '92. In actual fact, that conference in Rio actually asked the United Nations Statistical Commission, which is the gathering of all of the statistical heads in each country, to produce a report. What can we do about this whole issue of extending the national accounts and saying that the economy is not enough, we need to get into the broader notion. So that builds on the whole notion of sustainable development from the Brundtland Commission back in '87. So it's really extended from that. I think it got caught up for 20 years in perhaps the accountants getting a little bit too discussing it amongst themselves about what the best way to do it, rather than making a clearer statement and really treading on the path. But at the same time, the whole discussion of the environment is one that is gradually gaining momentum. So
I mean, even things like carbon trading and stuff like that, I mean, that sort of fits into the general sense, doesn't it?
It does. It does. Certainly accounting for carbon is within the scope of natural capital accounting. It just, in part, the essence at the end of the day, I said right at the start that our attempt is to break things down and then we can measure things. Ultimately, however, though, we want to see how it all fits together as a system. And that's where some of the thinking still has to get to about how we do that.
And on that note, we're out of time.
Okay.
Carl Obst, it's a great pleasure having you on the program. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Enjoyed the time.
Thank you. You've been watching One on One. Join us again tomorrow for another edition.